In 1977, TSR released a new version of Dungeons and Dragons, edited by Eric J. Holmes. I'm going to talk about the differences that were made in this edition of the game and how it influenced the future of Dungeons and Dragons today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another edition of my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. Also kind of exciting, it's also the start of a new sub-series of my history series that's going to be dedicated to discussing the differences in each edition of the game and comparing it to the edition that came before to understand why these changes were made, what the changes were, and then again, how they impacted the future of the game moving forward. So I have made a video. It was actually the fifth video I ever made for the channel back in February or maybe early March of 2023 about the editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the history of the different editions. And in that video, I mentioned that I think, or as a way of talking about the editions to help distinguish them, that there are 18 different editions, and that was in 2023. So now it would be 19 with the new 2024 release of Dungeons and Dragons that came out this year. So I will tell you, most people wouldn't count it as 19, but I did it just for the sake of having a way of discussing the different printings and different editions that have come out. So I'll get into that a little bit, but you might want to check that video out. You don't have to watch it before watching this, but I would highly recommend it just to help understand the differences in the nomenclature of what I'm talking about when I talk about different editions. So I'll put a link to that up here in the upper right-hand corner. So what I'm going to be discussing for these videos, for the series, is, again, the changes that were made in each new edition that's being printed, and not just in mechanics. So that's going to be probably the bulk of it, talking about the rules changes that happen. But I'm also going to get into discussing the creators, the writers and the artists, but also the aesthetics or the vibe, however you want to phrase that term, in terms of the types of content and how they describe that content in the game in that particular edition. And then even things such as like the layout and how the information is being conveyed. So we'll go through all of that as we go through this particular series. So again, this one's going to be focusing on this edition, the Holmes edition of Dungeons and Dragons from 1977, and then comparing it to original Dungeons and Dragons from 1974. So we do have to have a little brief history to kind of talk about, how we name this and when it came out. Again, original D&D, and then this version of the game, just to have a quick understanding so that we're all on the same page as far as the terms that I'm using. So if this kind of history is interesting to you, you enjoy this and want to learn more, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and then hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos such as this one. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about this particular version of the game. So I'm going to call this Holmes Basic. Okay, so it was not called Holmes Basic when it was released. It was just called Dungeons and Dragons. This is the rule book, and it was originally a part of a boxed set. I'll put a picture of that up here because I never had this box set. So this came out before I started playing. As I've mentioned before, I started in 1981 with the Molde Basic set. However, this was Holmes, and so some people will call this Holmes Basic, as I do. Other people will just call it Basic D&D. Some people will call it D&D because it is just called Dungeons and Dragons. You see, it doesn't say Basic anywhere on here. It said it on the box set. It said Basic Set, but the rule book just said Dungeons and Dragons. And then some people will call this the Blue Box or the Blue Book. Again, it's pretty obvious why is this cover here. And none of those terms, again, are official. The official name for this game was Dungeons and Dragons, and this was intended to be a revision and a simplification and a clarification of the rules from this. Also, Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, it's the same font, right? Or pretty close, at least. And this, again, was also just called Dungeons and Dragons. The reason I'm bringing that up is because in 1977, also after this is released, a few months later, you're going to have the release of this book, which is the start of the advanced. You see, it says right here, Advanced D&D. This is the Monster Manual, which was the first book of that. But at that point, the product line diverged between these, which were Dungeons and Dragons, and this and its subsequent releases, the Player's Handbook in 1978 and the Dungeon Master's Guide in 1979, which are part of the advanced D&D line. And they were not intended to be compatible. They were they were marketed and explained as being two completely different game lines. We've talked a little bit before about why that. It's partially for legal reasons. I think that would be the main reason for that. And again, we've discussed that before. So now this book here, or this set, the basic set of Holmes edition of Dungeons and Dragons, is in a really interesting place because it's acting as a bridge between this and this. And it's the only basic set that's going to do that. So there are going to be subsequent basic sets of Dungeons and Dragons, which again, they just called Dungeons and Dragons line. Edited. The first one after this is going to be 1981 by Thomas Mulvey. Then you're going to have the Frank Messer version, commonly called Beckme, 1983. And then that one's going to kind of stick around, but it's going to have several different versions. There's going to be the Easy to Master version, or the Black Box, in 91, I think that was. Also when the Rules Cyclopedia is released. And then in 95, again, I'm a little shit, it could be 94, 95, there was the classic Dungeons and Dragons game that was released. All those, so the Rules Cyclopedia, Easy to Master, and Classic were all based on the Menser Beckme line. Okay. But none of those have any connection to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons other than that they were published by the same company. This version of the game specifically mentions and directs people to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons if you want to play characters past third level, because this game only covers the first 3 levels of play. We'll get into the details of that in a second. But that was kind of how this game kind of came about. Now, the person who edited this game, you see here, edited by Eric Holmes. So who's Eric Holmes? Well, he was a professor of neurology at USC, right here in my backyard. In Pasadena, and USC is in, downtown Los Angeles, close to Exposition Park. And he he unfortunately passed away at age 80 in 2010, so about 14 years ago. He was a first lieutenant in the Marines. And he actually served 2 years in Korea, during the war fighting there. And he was a medical doctor, and he was a huge science fiction and fantasy fan. And he began writing short stories as early as 1951 is what I found. And later on, he was introduced to some folks and learned to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I've talked a little bit about this before, but there was a contingent of folks out here on the West Coast, particularly at Caltech, but also Santa Monica in Aero Hobbies. And then there was another contingent of folks up in the Bay Area in San Francisco that all were early adopters of Dungeons and Dragons. And Eric was part of those groups. A little bit, from what I understand, I think he was a little bit more connected to maybe the Caltech folks than he was the folks at Aero Hobbies in Santa Monica. But there was a lot of movement between those groups. And in any event, so he approached TSR and offered his services, being a professor of neurology. And he had a lot of education about how to teach information, teach complicated subjects to other people. And he offered to write an introductory version of this game, to clean up the rules and make them more approachable and understandable for a set of younger folks. So he wanted to help the game expand its audience and get mass distribution so that it wasn't only appealing to a small segment of college-age kids and also war gamers. He wanted it to appeal to younger gamers. And so he approached them. And from what I understand, he actually offered to do this at no costs. So he was volunteering his services. So for a young fledgling company like Dungeons and Dragons at the time, who up until this point, these were selling pretty well, but they probably didn't have a ton of money to offer people. Their sort of success is going to happen in the wake of like this book, this box set, the Holmes Basic box set is going to sell like gangbusters. So those are the things that are going to help the company put it on the map and make a lot of money. Okay, so at the time, probably didn't have that level of capital to pay someone to do this job. So very nice of Dr. Holmes he was a medical doctor, as I mentioned, to offer his services to volunteer to do this. So really quick, I will point out, as you see here in the credits, so it says edited by Eric J. Holmes for Jeff and Chris. So it doesn't say, but I believe that these are Eric Holmes's kids, because I know he has a son named Christopher who I don't want to say frequently, but he has several different times commented on some of my videos and talked about his recollections of what his dad was doing and why he did them and how things came about and things like that, which is really great to get that firsthand knowledge. So again, I highly recommend folks, if you watch one of my videos, especially if it's about these history topics, it's quite common to get ex-TSR folks or other folks that are connected to the hobby or knew those folks, like are friends with them or gamed with them or whatever, whether or not they worked at TSR, to make comments. Sometimes they're corrections, sometimes it's validations, sometimes it's just adding additional information, things like that. So it is a wealth of information down there, and I try to get to as many comments as I can. They come in faster than I can answer, but I do try to keep up. Okay, so now we need to talk about why. Why, other than him wanting to create a version of the game that was easier to understand for younger folks. Well, the other thing that you have, and one of the reasons that why this project came up, is again, you have this original 3-volume set. Mine is a much later printing, original collector's edition. I just point that out for folks who, I know that this isn't a first printing, okay, but it is what people would call original Dungeons and Dragons. Some people will call it 0E or 0 edition. I've heard like some folks say zeroth or zeroth, which that makes no sense to me. Just call it 0 edition. Don't try to put a TH on a 0. That's strange. But anyway, it was in these 3 books. Okay. And then it had these little reference sheets at the back. But then after this is published, you have a whole bunch of supplements coming out. You have Supplement 1, 1975. This is Greyhawk. You have Supplement 2, also 1975, printed later. Now, my understanding, again, is this was actually supposed to be printed first because Blackmore came before Greyhawk in the timeline of role-playing games. However, this required, according to some people, more editing than this. So this one was put out first. But in any event, you have 2 supplemental books that come out in 1975. And then you have Eldritch Wizardry, 1976. You've got Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, also 1976. So you have all these supplements. You have more supplements than you have original books. This is 3 volumes, and this is 4 supplements. And so there was just a lot of material that was scattered across so many different sources. And so one of the things that this version of the game was going to do was to bring all that stuff together, pick out all the parts that you needed from these books to play and make it easier. So as I mentioned, this also only covers the first 3 levels of play, 1 through 3. So that's going to be important as we continue to go on through this. So again, one of the things that's really interesting when you look at this book, and it talks about what the purpose is. So there's a preface based upon the original work published in 1974 and 3 supplemental booklets published in a 2-year period after the initial release of Dungeons and Dragons, aimed solely at introducing the reader to the concepts of fantasy role-playing and the basic play of this game. To this end, it limits itself to basics. The rules herein allow only for the first 3 levels of progression, and instructions for the game referee and dungeon master are kept to the minimum necessary to allow him to conduct basic games. This is absolutely necessary because the game is completely open-ended, is subject to modification, expansion, interpretation, and it goes on and on, okay? And then it says here at the end, This work is far more detailed and more easily understood than were the original booklets, nonetheless, for with it and the other basic components of the game, any intelligent and imaginative person can speedily understand and play Dungeons and Dragons as it was meant to be played. Players who desire to go beyond the basic game are directed to the advanced Dungeons and Dragons books. So again, this originally, in addition to serving as an introduction to the game and to helping bring in a new variety of player who didn't have that wargaming background and perhaps were a little younger, in addition to doing that, it's also helping create a bridge to advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I think that's one of the reasons why this game was replaced later on by the Moldvay edition of basic Dungeons and Dragons. And Moldvay makes a lot of changes to this. And because this is trying to take rules from here, but also presage what's going to end up in here. And that was very difficult because when this was being written, the rules for advanced D&D weren't done yet. So Gary Gygax is working on the monster manual, which isn't rules. This is just monsters. And you can very easily use this book with this edition of the game, or you can use it with this edition of the game, or you can use it later on with the full release of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But the rules for the character classes, spells, equipment, races, alignment, and then all the rules on how to run the game, the combat, treasure, all that kind of stuff, isn't going to come out until a few years after this is published. All right, let's continue on and talk about the creators of this. And the only other one I'm going to really focus on here is the cover artist for this book, also obviously for the box set. So this is just some people call this monochromatic version. It's just all blue, shades of blue of the original cover art, which was full color. And this is by David C. Sutherland. Okay, so David C. Sutherland from Minneapolis, which is, the Twin Cities area where Dave Arneson and his gaming group was gaming. And Dave Sutherland also served in the armed forces. So he was in the U.S. Army and served in military police during the Vietnam War. And he met a gentleman by the name of Mike Mornard, who is famous for, being one of the people, I think, from my understanding I think he's the only person who gamed directly with Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, and M.A.R. Barker from Empire of the Petal Throne. And so he was kind of moving between the groups, and he has a very famous sort of what they call the Mornard fragments, which are like an early version of Dungeons and Dragons, pre-publication Dungeons and Dragons that he had. And so you can find those fragments online. I forget exactly where they're housed. If I can find it, I'll put a link in the show notes. But I think it might be the same ones that Wizard of the Coast included in their 50th anniversary, that giant book that came out earlier this year. So I don't have that one yet. But he met David Sutherland. And so they knew each other because at the time Mike Bernard was gaming in both Greyhawk and in Blackmoor. And later on, Dave Sutherland is going to join the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is a living history group that really focuses mostly on the medieval European era. And through that group, the SCA, it's called, he met M.A.R. Barker, who introduced him to folks at TSR, and then eventually Dave Sutherland's going to get hired on as an artist. He was one of the original kind of hired artists. So the original game for OD&D, they used a lot of friends of people or some high school kids even did some of these drawings at the time. And they weren't staff members. They weren't employees. They were just doing kind of work for hire as they needed to. But Dave Sutherland's going to be one of the first 3 staff artists for Dungeons and Dragons. So if you watch my video, here's history series on Dragon Magazine, I talk a lot about that because Dave Sutherland's name is in the magazine at a certain point all the time because he was like the main staff artist. I think he was in charge of them for a little bit of time. And so it was him, Dave Trampier, and then Tom Wam. Okay, so they were hired, but also you've got Errol Otis and you've got people like Darlene, and they were kind of like that I don't want to, I guess you call them the second group of artists. If you take the ones that did the art, like Tracy Lesh, for example, did art in this, but again, he wasn't an employee. So Dave Sutherland does this, and he's all over the place. This is also Dave Sutherland. So he's moving in between both advanced Dungeons and Dragons and what we would call basic Dungeons and Dragons. When I was a kid, we definitely called anything that wasn't advanced Dungeons and Dragons, we called it basic Dungeons and Dragons. And for us to distinguish it, because D&D was the generic term, Dungeons and Dragons was generic. And so we would call it either advanced or basic. Those were the terms that we used. I've seen that commonly used, but technically, as I mentioned before, this was just Dungeons and Dragons. But Dave Sutherland worked on both, also worked obviously on Dragon Magazine. I just talked about that. And also famous for doing the cover of the 1979 Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, the one with the Ifrit on it. And Dave is actually going to work at TSR all the way up until 1997 when it is acquired by Wizards of the Coast. And so he sort of transitioned a little bit from doing illustration into doing maps. So I mentioned this before, my video on Ravenloft that I just did from my interview with William W. Connors, who worked on the Ravenloft line. Dave Sutherland did those really beautiful isometric style maps from the original Ravenloft module from 1983, Ravenloft I6 Ravenloft. So, and he unfortunately passed away in 2005. So most of the illustrations that you're going to find in here, I'd say a lot of them are by David C. Sutherland. So you can see this one is. So there's other artists in here as well. This one wasn't credited, so I wasn't quite sure who did this particular drawing. If anybody knows, go ahead and leave it in the show notes. But I think the most of them that as I went through this were done by David C. Sutherland. So there was at least one by Trompier, which I think was this one. Yeah. And then there's at least one by Tom Wam, which was coming up here. I think the next page or so. Yeah. This is a Tom Wam illustration. I mean, you can just tell right away from looking at it, but he also signed it TW. But a ton of these are by David C. Sutherland, and he signs them a lot of times with just DCS3, like Roman numeral 3. Like you can see it better in that one. Okay, so that's kind of going to be the illustrations for this particular book. So in terms of layout, so one of the things that this book does is it really improves the functionality of how to read it. It's easier to read. It's a bigger size. The typeface is a little bit bigger when you compare it to the original books. So you can see just right away. It's not much bigger, but it's a little bigger, or maybe it's just the font that's different. I found it easier to read, just for my old eyes. But you have the layout. There's better use of like headings, like this, and bold type, things like that. Because it's been 3 years, so you've had 3 years to improve the paste up, the layout. So again, in these old days, this wouldn't have been done on a computer. This would have been done with sheets of paper that were arranged and then cut out and pasted together to form the page, and then that page is then photographed and copied. Okay, so but just again, I think it's just easy to kind of tell how much easier it is to read this. Like looking at the spell descriptions, here's an example right here. So here's the spell descriptions from OD&D. And here they are listed here. All the information, like the little table, the little tables that you get, and all the information like the range, the level, the duration. Here it's all that is buried, and it's not presented consistently in terms of where that information is put all the time. So I found it much easier to look at in here. So that's a big improvement in terms of the layout. And then in terms of the aesthetics of this, the writing is more approachable. So you guys have heard me talk before about that sort of high Gygaxian style of writing, which can be very fun to read, but it can also be very, very frustrating. It's usually very kind of train of thought as opposed to concise way of conveying the information. Gary likes to use a lot of 50-cent words because, I think he used them because he thought it made him sound smart. So if there was a simple way to say something, but you could say it in a much more complicated and convoluted way, Gary was going to default to the complicated and convoluted way of saying it. So I've mentioned before, one of my all-time favorites was saying Senite instead of week. So it's just, that's a typical Gary Gygax, where it's a small example, but that's just kind of how he wrote. So this is written to be approachable for somebody who, again, a younger person who might not have that vocabulary, but also to make sure that it's clear what it is that you're doing. So even the introduction that starts out, Dungeons and Dragons is a fantastic, exciting, and imaginative game of role-playing for adults 12 years and up. Each player creates a character or characters who may be dwarves, elves, halflings, or humans, fighting men, magic users, pious clerics, or wily thieves. The characters are then plunged into an adventure in a series of dungeons, tunnels, secret rooms, and caverns run by another player, the referee, often called the Dungeon Master. So that's the introduction to Holmes. And then if you look at the introduction here, these rules are as complete as possible within the limitations imposed by the space of 3 booklets. That is, they cover the major aspects of fantasy campaigns, but still remain flexible. As with any other set of miniature rules, they are guidelines to follow in designing your own fantastic medieval campaign. So and again, the problem is, it's not the problem. The reason this is written this way is because it was written with the understanding that you would know what it is that you were buying if you bought this. Gary and Dave were playing with their friends, and Gary wrote this in a manner to help those people be able to play games with him. They never could have imagined when they first published this, how it was going to explode and how it was just going to become so popular. One of the reasons there were so many variants of the game, such as like Tunnels and Trolls, which comes out just a year after this, is because the folks out here in California that got a hold of these rules couldn't make head or tails of this because they didn't game with the original creators. So they created their own version that made sense to them. And that's why this is written that way. So I don't want to fault Gary for writing it this way, but this is not written for someone who has no idea what this is to be able to understand what this is and pick it up. But this right away, you understand what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Okay, so it's just a different style, and that's why this was created. So, but that's part of I'm calling it the aesthetics or the vibe. Maybe that's not the right term, but much more approachable. It has better explanations of everything, clearer explanations so there's less arguments at the table because it's much more clear, as I said. Now, one of the things that this is going to do is, again, take these 3 books here, strip it down to just cover the first 3 levels, and then, like I said, make it clearer and easier to understand. But it's also going to take material from these 4 books and put them in there. However, really, it's going to take material from just this one. So there is very, very little, if anything, especially from Eldritch Wizardry and Blackmore in this version. However, there's a bit from this one. Most specifically is going to be the main character class that they introduced in here, which is going to be the Thief, which was introduced. So it wasn't an original part of the game. If you're new to the channel, you might not know that. Thieves are what you would now call rogues, and starting with 3rd edition on, were not an original character class. There were only 3 clerics, magic users, and what they called fighting men or fighters. This added the 4th class of thief for that kind of classic 4. And that came from Greyhawk, and that's going to be part of this version of the game, 1977, and has remained part of the game all the way through. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit about the layout and the aesthetics and things like that. So then next up, we can talk about the mechanics and get into some of the nitty-gritty details of like what was going to change. Now, for this part of the video and the discussion of these mechanical changes, I really, really want to thank Xenopus Archives for his blog. It's been immensely helpful. And I have done another video a little bit about Holmes before when I talked about the connection to Caltech, because Caltech is right here by me in Pasadena. And as I mentioned in my follow-up video, that I actually forgot to thank Xenopus Archives in that Caltech video, so I want to make sure I do it this time. So I found a kind of a list of changes that Xenopus Archives put together, talking about all the changes between Holmes Basic D&D and original D&D. So that was a huge help. Now, Xenopus Archives has been around for a long time. I mean, I hesitate to say 20 years, but I think it's pretty close. It might even be longer. So I didn't discover the blog until around 2000, maybe 2009, 10, or 11, somewhere in that neighborhood. But he's kind of known as being like, I'd say he's the premier authority on the Holmes edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, if you want to know why it's called Xenopus Archives, you have to look no further than the sample dungeon that is included in here. And it says right here at the very top, 100 years ago, the sorcerer Xenopus, and again, I say Xenopus because that's how I've always said it. It's very possible it might be pronounced Xenopus, or that's how that blog pronounces it, but I'm going to say Xenopus, so apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. 100 years ago, the sorcerer Xenopus built a tower on the low hills overlooking Port Town. The tower was close to the sea cliff west of the town and appropriately next door to the graveyard. So this is the tower. And so he's created a whole blog using that name that's all about, well, not all about, but mostly focuses on the Holmes edition of D&D. So again, a huge shout out and thanks to Xenopus Archives for helping with this list of some of the mechanical changes. All right, so let's dive into some of these mechanical changes. And I'm really going to do the major ones. There's a lot of little kind of minor ones that I'm not necessarily going to cover. I'm also not going to cover any typos or things like that. So I'm really looking at sort of major changes that are occurring between this edition and, again, the edition that preceded it, the OD&D, white box, original D&D 0 edition, whatever. All right, so let's just jump in and start talking about ability scores. So I'm going to kind of divide this into sections. So the first section is going to be characters. Under the characters, the first subsection of that is going to be the ability scores. So the main thing here, it's the same 6 ability scores, and they're listed in the same order as they are in original D&D. So strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. So some of the changes that are going to happen in here. So first off is going to be the bonuses that you get for the different ability scores. So people who know original D&D, or if you've seen my video on the history of the 6 ability scores in Dungeons and Dragons, you know that in original D&D, the bonuses and penalties were very, very few and far between. So as you see here, the only ones that you're really seeing as far as bonuses and penalties are going to be for Constitution and Dexterity. And the Constitution is going to give you these different bonuses for if you have a high Constitution to your hit die. Now, this table here is coming out of Greyhawk. So they lifted the Constitution bonus table from Greyhawk, not from original Dungeons and Dragons. So this one here, as you see, giving you a +3 to hit points at an 18 score of Constitution, a +2 at 17, and then a +1 at either 15 or 16. In original D&D, the Constitution bonuses were just +1 for anything over, I want to say it was 13. Uh, 15 or more gave you a +1. Okay, so Greyhawk added a little bit more granularity to that, and Holmes picks that up. However, there was additional granularity in Greyhawk for strength for fighters and also dexterity for fighters. So in this version of the game, a fighter with a high dexterity gets a bonus to armor class, and a fighter with a high strength gets bonuses to hit probability and damage, and then also gets to roll exceptional strength, as you see here. And again, I've covered all this in that video on the 6 ability scores. That does not get picked up here. So this doesn't do anything. This doesn't have any kind of bonuses or anything like that for strength. Okay, it just mentions it. So the main thing for strength is that it's the prime requisite for fighters. And so if you have a 13 or higher, you get a bonus to your earned experience points if you're a fighter and you have a strength of 13 or higher. And that's most of the ability scores in here. So a couple other things that this does, it also picks up for intelligence. It's going to come later. This table here, the chance to know any given spell and the number of spells knowable per level, minimum and maximum, based on your intelligence score, that is also coming from Greyhawk. That was not part of original Dungeons and Dragons. So you can see he's kind of picking and choosing things that he's going to use from both of these sources that came prior to this edition. So that's intelligence. Charisma in here really doesn't do anything. So in original Dungeons and Dragons, there's information on charisma for getting bonuses, as you see here, how many hirelings you get and their loyalty base. Okay, this doesn't have that at all. So the only place that it discusses hirelings is here. In all probability, the referee will find it beneficial to allow participants to hire into service one or more characters. So it talks about hiring them. There's no costs in here for that, like there are in here. There's not a list of what kind of people you can hire, and there's nothing in here to do with their loyalty score or how many you can hire, anything like that based on your charisma. It doesn't deal with that at all. It just kind of tells you how much they might cost. And then also the monster reaction table here doesn't show you any bonuses for having a high charisma or a penalty for having a low charisma. So that was all stripped out of here, I'm guessing just for ease of play. But it kind of makes charisma sort of a stat that really has no impact on your playability. So it's not a prime requisite for anybody. And so that's kind of a interesting and an odd choice, I think, because hirelings and retainers were such a huge part of original Dungeons and Dragons, having extra people around to help carry torches, carry treasure, go in front of you so that they can spring the trap instead of you, like all that kind of stuff. Okay. So then another thing that this is going to do is it's going to introduce prime requisites for dwarves and halflings, which do not exist in this book. So in here, it's going to tell you that for Constitution, dwarves and halflings have to have a constitution of 9 or greater. And then halflings, in addition to that, have to have a dexterity of 9 or greater to be a halfling. Okay, so again, that didn't exist in here. And that was added in this particular version of the game. So that's where you start to see things like in, say, 3rd edition or 4th edition, where different races got different bonuses to different ability scores. Even advanced D&D would give you bonuses to different ability scores, and advanced also has minimums. Like it'll tell you, oh, if you have a strength lower than or a constitution lower than a certain amount, you can't be a dwarf. And if your dexterity is lower than a certain amount, you can't be a halfling. All that started in here. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of the ability scores. So grabbing some stuff, but not all, from Greyhawk, taking some stuff out from here, and then introducing some brand new stuff like those prime requisites for dwarves and halflings that weren't part of the original game. And that is going to be a quick snapshot of what we're going to see throughout our look at this book. There's stuff that's retained from here. There's stuff that's incorporated from here. There's stuff that's taken out of here. And then there's brand new stuff that didn't exist anywhere else. So just kind of a really unique, fun point in time looking at the development of the game. This is only 3 years after this came out, so they're still figuring things out. Okay, so that is ability scores. Now let's go on to the different races. So this has the same standard races that are listed in OD&D, which is going to be dwarves, elves, and halflings. Half-elves are introduced in Greyhawk. This book doesn't use them. Okay, so there's no half-elves in here. And it doesn't really discuss half-elves at all. So now one of the things that's really, really interesting in here is that, again, we have the ability score minimums for dwarves and halflings. Elves is another big one here. So if you look at elves are 5 or more feet in height, blah, blah, blah. Use all weapons and armor of the fighting man, including all magical weapons, and can also cast spells like a magic user. They detect secret doors, infravision, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So, but it just talks about like they operate, thus they have the advantages of both fighting men and magic users, as well as certain special capabilities of their own. They progress in level as both fighting men and magic users, but since each game nets them experience in both categories equally, they progress more slowly than other characters. Now, let's look at how that was worded in here. And I have talked about this before, but it is very different. Elves can begin as either fighting men or magic users. So it says begin as either fighting men or magic users, and freely switch class whenever they choose from adventure to adventure, but not during the course of a single game. So that's a huge change. Now, first off, this was worded so awkwardly and clunkily that people to this day still argue about what this means. Because what constitutes an adventure? Is it a game session? Is it a campaign? Is it a single module, like to finish it to its conclusion, or a single, story arc? Whatever it is. I mean, they didn't have story arcs back then necessarily, but what does that mean? And switching back and forth. So what this is really kind of saying is that, well, if I just decided at the beginning of this adventure that I'm going to act as a fighter, then I can't cast magic spells because I'm acting as a fighter. But then when that adventure is over, I can say, okay, next time I'm going to act as a magic user. So very awkward. This just gets rid of that for very good reason, because it was really clunky and awkward and made no sense. And then the balance of that is that it takes them longer to progress because they're getting the benefits of both classes at the same time as they move up in level. Okay, so that's a huge change that's introduced in this book, and that's going to be the change that kind of goes forward throughout the basic line of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so it has thieves, as I mentioned, and one of the things that it says in here regarding the thief, it says they're humans with special abilities. Okay, but then later on it says that there are special rules for halflings, dwarves, and elves who wish to be thieves. These are given in advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So this is one of those, you're splitting hairs in terms of the way that you're using language, because it says that dwarves are stocky build and they wear long builds, and it says they're sturdy fighters. It already told you that elves operate as fighters and magic users. And then it tells you later that halflings, it doesn't say they're fighters, but that's what they are. So that would be considered technically race as class, meaning you're playing an elf, not an elf fighter magic user. However, it does say you can also be an elf, dwarf, or halfling thief. It's just they're not going to explain the rules in this edition how to do that. You have to look at advanced D&D. But to me, because they tell you that these three races can also be thieves, this is technically not race as class. Neither is this. Especially once you introduce this into the game, this does have rules for dwarves, elves, and halflings operating as thieves. And so once you add the Greyhawk supplement to OD&D, it is no longer a race as class game. In this game, it tells you dwarves are fighters, halflings are fighters, but you're a dwarf fighter in this. This one, you're technically a dwarf, except you could also be a dwarf thief, like I said. So again, it's splitting hairs. Some people are going to argue about that, but I would say that Holmes D&D is still technically not race as class, just from the way that it's worded. Okay, so that's kind of it for the races. All right, and then next up we have a discussion about the classes. So we've already talked about the biggest change in the classes, which is that this includes thieves as a fourth class that were not part of original D&D until you got to the Greyhawk supplement. Now, something else that comes up is regarding clerics and their alignment. So let's dig into this original D&D and see what it tells us about clerics. It says right here, note that clerics of 7th level and greater are either law or chaos, and there is a sharp distinction between them. So this is telling you once you hit 7th level, you cannot be a neutral cleric. You have to have picked between law and chaos. Okay, but that's at 7th level. So the way that's worded, that would imply that between 1st and 6th level, you could be a neutral cleric. But once you hit 7th level, you have to choose whether to be law or chaos. In this version of the game, it tells you right out the gate, depending on the god, the cleric may be good or evil, lawful or chaotic. So you don't have the option to play in neutral here at any level. So that is part of the classes that's in here. So another thing that happens is the magic user spell list is different in here in terms of when they gain spells and how many that they gain. It's a very minor thing, but at 3rd level, they get 2 first level spells instead of 3. But it is a thing. That's a change. I guess it's a minor change, but it is a change nonetheless. The other main difference that's in here is this section right here. Accumulated experience is measured by experience points, and it goes on and on to tell you about that and how you gain experience. There is no theoretical limit to the number of levels a character may progress, such as a 15th level fighting man, 14th level wizard, etc. But only the first 3 levels are discussed in this book. Well, that's very different because it doesn't specify whether that applies to only the human classes or human races or anybody. It just says there's theoretically no limit to how high you can go. However, in original D&D, it's very detailed of if you want to play a dwarf, it tells you that you're going to be limited in levels. So they may never progress beyond 6th level Myrmidon. And same with elves. Elves can be 4th level heroes and up to 8th level magic users, which are called warlocks. And then halflings are limited to 4th level or hero. So that's a huge difference because this is telling you that demi-humans are limited in level and this one's not. Now, part of the reason that it's not getting into that is because this stops at 3rd level. So that makes sense. But if you didn't know that there were level limits from either having this game or if you eventually go on to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons starting with level 4 on, which does have level limits for non-humans, you wouldn't know necessarily that you would be limited in level if you were playing a dwarf, elf, or halfling. All right, so let's continue on. And we're still in the character section here. We're going to move to the next kind of major change. That's going to be this one on character alignment. So this is really interesting because in the original Dungeons and Dragons game, it was a 3-point alignment system: law, chaos, and neutrality. And I've talked about this before. I have a whole video series. It's a 2-parter on the history of alignment and planes in D&D. So I highly recommend that you check that out if you're looking for more information on where alignment comes from and why it was presented this way. But you see here, it's just law, neutrality, and chaos. And it doesn't tell you what it is. All it says is before the game begins, it's not only necessary to select a role, which means your character class, but it is also necessary to determine what stance the character will take: law, neutrality, or chaos. That is the sole and only definition of what alignment is in original D&D. And again, it's that 3-point system. So the Holmes version of the game is going to expand that to a 5-point system. So, and this is the only version of the game that has a 5-point system. So once you move past this, Advanced D&D, not in this book, Monster Manual doesn't really have a 9-point system. It adheres to the 5-point because it was being written while this was being written. But once you get to the player's handbook, that's going to go to the more familiar, what we now call the 9-point alignment system, where you have good, evil, and neutrality for all 3 of law, chaos, and neutrality. This has a 5-point. So it says characters can be lawful, and then it says good or evil, neutral, or chaotic good or evil. So this was something that Gary Gygax had worked on before in an article in the Strategic Review. So again, I'm going to go all into the details of that in that video on the history of alignment in D&D. But this graph comes exactly from that article. And it was... this is an addition that Gary or someone else made. So that's going to be at the very end of this video, or the end of the discussion of the Holmes Basic set. So one of the things that Xenopus Archives talked about is that I guess he has an original manuscript that was written by Holmes before it was edited. And in his version of the manuscript, this game had a 3-point alignment system, just like original D&D. So somebody, either Gary Gygax or someone at TSR, when this was being kind of gone over by the powers that be, they changed it to this 5-point system. And so this, again, was not part of the original manuscript for Holmes. And it is the only edition where you have that 5-point system, which I think is really interesting. And it does, again, like I said, it matches well with this. So this has creatures that are like lawful evil or chaotic evil. It doesn't have any creatures that are outright just called neutral evil. Now, there were some that will say like it's one thing, and then in parentheses it'll have like another word. So it kind of skirts the line. There's like 3 or 4 examples of that where there's something that, and I don't remember exactly which ones off the top of my head, but something might say like it's like neutral and then parentheses say chaotic or something like that. And again, it's just a few small examples, but for the most part, this adheres to the 5-point system that works with this. And then later on in future editions, Fiend Folio, the Monster Manual, then you get your neutral evils and your neutral good and your chaotic neutral and your lawful neutral, all of which are missing from this. Okay, so what else is different in this game? Well, now we've moved past the character section. We're going to go into the next section, which is this one here, equipment, list of equipment and weapons. So kind of a short little section here, but one of the things that got added in here, which I think is kind of fun, different, something that I hadn't thought about, is he adds a tinderbox to the list of equipment that you can get in here. And that was missing from original D&D. Now, another thing that happens in this is that there's a list of like vehicles and stuff like that, and Holmes removes a lot of like the more expensive ships. So I didn't mark the page here, but there's a ton of ships listed in here, and a lot of them are removed from this version of the game. Okay, so the big thing though for the equipment, other than that, is that if you notice here, there's two things missing. Okay, so one we're going to talk about in the combat section. The other one, though, as you see here, there's an item and a cost. There's no weight given. There's nothing in here to tell you how much these items weigh. And when you get to encumbrance, you'll see it says, a backpack or sack will hold weight which equals approximately 300 gold pieces. For game purposes, all forms of coin weigh the same. Character carrying 300 gold pieces would not be considered to be heavily loaded, assuming that the other equipment he or she carried was not excessive. 300 gold pieces are assumed to weigh about 30 pounds, and a character with 600 gold pieces carrying 60 pounds would be considered fully loaded or heavily loaded, as the weight of the other equipment normally carried would make the character's load in the neighborhood of 75 pounds. So it basically, and then it just says, in order to give the player a better idea, just kind of like write down what you're carrying it. And it doesn't say this, but, paraphrasing, it's basically just like eyeball it and make sure you're not carrying too much. So as you see here, this gives you an example of what someone might be carrying, and there's no weights attached to this. So this is referred to as the simplified encumbrance system. Okay, now in here, if we look at encumbrance, you see here, it gives you weights, which can be carried of everything that you might have, what kind of armor, weapon, shield, miscellaneous equipment, maximum load per person at half movement, at half normal movement. And then it gives you this example of totaling all up. So this wants you to actually do the math and figure out how much you're carrying, and then determine what speed you can move at based on, how much you have. So that was much more detailed, and it's going to be simplified here. Now again, in 5e, I don't even think people care about encumbrance anymore. They don't worry about it, but it's a huge part of the resource management of this, or of the early editions of the game. I would say really all the way up through second edition, although in 2e, they were really kind of starting to sort of move away from that. But to me, it's an extremely fun part of the game, which is knowing that you're going to be on this mission and you have to pick and choose what you're going to bring, because you can't bring everything. You just don't have the resources or the strength, the capacity to do that, unless you hire a bunch of hirelings to come with you to carry them all. And then that brings in its own, dangers, because they are going to make more noise. You've got more people, you've got more mouths to feed, you're spending more money on them. So is that going to be worth it based on kind of treasure that you're going to get back? All that kind of stuff is related to that. And to me, that's part of the game. And I know a lot of people don't like that. They want to hand wave it and just go like, oh, we're heroes. We can have everything that we want at our fingertips. Or I just have a bag of holding and the entire, equipment list from the PHBs in my bag of holding, or like whatever. And that's fine. I don't like to play that way. So in my daughter's game, like, they mark down when they run out of torches or when they're using the oil for their lamp. And just how anxious they get when they realize that they're running out of food and they have to start sharing their rations, and they might not be able to get back up out of the dungeon before they run out. That kind of stuff, they love that. And because to them, it adds to the immersion of the game. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now. So that is the equipment section. Now, the next section, and probably the biggest section of changes, is going to come in combat. So again, probably the most changes. One of the biggest ones is movement. So this game tells you how far people can move, and what that means. Okay, so time and movement in the dungeon, and it talks about all that in here. Movement in here in OD&D is really kind of related to this, and it's combat movement. And even this doesn't explain it well because it's giving movement in inches and not translating what that means. So it's doing inches because you were wargaming. So you were on a grid and you had figures that you would move to see if they were in firing range, or if they were close enough to charge and engage in melee, or how far a missile, like a catapult or a cannon could fire, anything like that. That was the important stuff, but it was based on your miniature figures and using an inch scale, and that's the measurement. So it doesn't really get into that. And because this relied on knowledge of chainmail for doing a lot of things, and I've talked all about that before, it doesn't really get into distances. Okay. And it really doesn't even get into time. And we'll talk about that in a second. But movement is much more explained here in terms of how far you can go and what that means. And both in and out of combat and during exploration. Now, this does deal with movement for exploration and tells you how many hexes you can travel in a day. So that part is in there. But as far as like movement during combat, it's not really explained. Or at least I don't think it's explained very good for me. All right. Now, a couple of things that are going to be added in here are all going to come here on page 20 when it gets into how to run combat. And it is laid out here so much more concisely and easy to understand than it is in OD&D. But it talks about combat rounds, time, and movement in melee. See, there's nothing like that in here. Like just this one sentence alone, or this header, just really helps you know what exactly you're getting into. So it talks about the rounds of combat. Return each turn. Each round is 10 seconds and a combat, and then there are 10 rounds to a turn. So a minute and 40 seconds, which is an odd choice, but an exploration round is 10 minutes. So a combat round is much, much quicker. Okay, so in OD&D, what it says is that, it tells you that, a turn takes, I think it's also 10 minutes for exploration, like how far you can move while you're mapping, you're being careful, you're not trying to trip any traps and things like that. You're going slowly. And then it says combat is fast and furious, and like rounds are quicker. It doesn't tell you how long it is. It just says it's fast and furious. So you had to kind of figure out as a DM to adjudicate how fast that round should be. Here it tells you it's 10 seconds. Now in AD&D, it's going to go to 60 seconds, which is kind of weird, but it's not weird. It's just different. So I'm not sure that 60 seconds is fast and furious. So and it says that combat turns shorter and there results in at least as much muscular fatigue. Movement, if any, is usually at a sprint, and an unarmed man can move 20 feet per melee round, and a fully armored man only 10 feet. So it gets into that. And then a few things that are interesting in here. So initiative. This tells you that initiative is determined right here. Who gets the first blow? It's the highest dexterity strikes first. You're not rolling, which is so quick and fast. You just know who has the highest dexterity. And then it tells you if the monster didn't have a dexterity listed, just roll it on the spot and see who gets it. And then it says if people are within 1 or 2 points of each other on their dexterity, like a 15 and a 16, then you roll a d6 and the highest goes first. So that's how you determine initiative. Initiative here is determined, who knows, because this doesn't tell you anything about initiative. Now, there is some combat procedures in chainmail that talk about like move, counter move, or there's simultaneous move, which I guess you could consider to be initiative because it tells you how to figure out who goes first in those particular cases. But if you are using the alternative combat system from here, which is, as I've mentioned several times, the system that we end up using moving forward, that's rolling a 20 and comparing it to a target number, whether it's ascending or descending is irrelevant. That's the system that we use. Chainmail doesn't use that system, but the alternative combat system in here doesn't tell you how to determine who goes first. There's no initiative. So this is giving you initiative. As far as I know, this is the only edition of D&D that uses dexterity for initiative, but you could easily use that in any game that you want, or any edition that you want, rather than the cumbersome way of having to roll. And then, everyone's keeping track and you re-roll it every round and you never know who's going first and people don't pay attention and no one's ready when it gets to be their turn. Okay, so that's that. Now, a couple other things in the combat section here. There's a really fun section where it talks about light weapons such as the dagger allow 2 blows per round, but then conversely, heavy-handed two-handed sword, battle axe, halberd, flail, morningstar, and most polearms can only go every other round. Okay, so that was a way of distinguishing between these different weapons, which is interesting because another thing that this is going to pick up from original Dungeons and Dragons. So something that was changed in Greyhawk as an option was to have variable damage by weapon type in here. I think it was in Greyhawk. It might have been a separate part in OD&D too. But the original way of doing weapon damage in OD&D was every weapon does D6. And this picks that up. So regardless if you have a dagger or a two-handed sword, it's going to do D6. So that's kind of the downside of not having variable damage, is that if you have a dagger that does D6 damage and you can get 2 blows per round because it's a light weapon, versus a two-handed sword that also does D6 damage and only goes every other turn, there's no reason why you would carry a two-handed sword other than just you think it looks cool. But if you're trying to, so early min-maxing, the early min-maxing this would be everybody would use a dagger or a light-handed weapon, and they would get 2 strikes per round. And there's no penalty or anything like that. It's not like your second attack is at a lower to hit rate like it would be, say, in 3rd edition that had iterative attacks. So that's a difference in here. And then monsters, however, in this version of the game are going to do variable damage. So unlike the PCs that all do D6, every monster here has a different kind of damage that it does. So a berserker does 1 to 8 points, whereas a bandit does 1 to 6 points. Right there. Okay, so that's a difference in OD&D versus Holmes. And it has new rules in here for flaming oil. So there's a whole section on that here in fire, and it talks about flasks of oil can be spread on the floor of the dungeon and ignited, how big the pool is, how much damage it does. That's all new and different in Holmes versus like really not a big discussion of that in original D&D. And then it also deals with healing. So this is the last part of the combat section here. On page 7, right here, it says, treat each day of rest and recuperation back home to generate 1 to 3 of hit points for the next adventure. So each day you get 1 to 3 hit points. In here, original D&D, it's all the way buried in here on page 35. So almost the last page of the 3rd book, volume 3. And it tells you healing wounds, and it tells you get 1 hit point every other day until you're completely healed. This can take a long time. So that was a big change. So, getting 1 point every other day versus here, you're getting 1 to 3 points every day that you're home and not adventuring. So that's going to wrap up the changes for the combat section. Next up, we're going to get into changes for magic. Quick reminder, if you'd like to support me and the Daddy Roll the One channel, the 2 best ways you can do that right now will be to order something from my shop with an exclusive design on a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, etc. I have a bunch of different designs there. Again, they're all exclusive to my shop. And this is November 18th. So if you're ordering from the holidays, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to order sooner rather than later. So it looks like there's been a few printing delays with the vendor that I work with, which is Teespring. And so I want to ensure that you guys get your stuff in time if you're giving it as a gift to someone or maybe to yourself and you want to have it before the holidays. So I would recommend that you order that as quickly as possible. And then secondly, the other way you can support me is by becoming a super fan. Just look for that heart logo with the $sign in it. Right underneath the channel or the video description here on YouTube, and you can join these other fine folks to become a super fan and get a special thank you, and it really helps to support my channel. So thanks so much for that support. Now let's get into a discussion of the changes in magic. So these actually aren't as expansive and as detailed as you might think. So really the main changes here are going to be in the lists of spells, because the Holmes edition is going to include a lot more spells than we found in OD&D. So if we look here at the list of magic user spells, as an example, I'm not going to go through every level of spell, but here's the list of magic user spells. So if you look at the first level ones here, not in alphabetical order for some reason, but this is OD&D. Detect magic, hold portal, read magic, read languages, protection from evil, light, charm person, and sleep. Now let's look over here. So that's only 8 spells. As we see, that's been expanded over here. You've got Charm Person, Dancing Lights, Detect Magic Enlargements, Hold Portal, Light Magic Missile, Protection from Evil, Read Languages, Read Magic, Shield, Sleep, Tensor's Floating Disc, and Ventriloquism. So it's expanded, and that's going to be the case for pretty much every level of spell in here. Interestingly enough, third level spells had the most listed in OD&D, and there's quite a few here as well. But so that's a big thing. There's lots of new spells in here, and so obviously they're all described. Now, one thing that you would notice is that Magic Missile was missing from the OD&D list of first level magic user spells. And the reason for that being is because Magic Missile is introduced here in the Greyhawk supplement. So as we go through this and we look at the introduction of that spell, let's just read what it says here. Magic Missile. This is from Greyhawk again, 1975. This is a conjured missile equivalent to a magic arrow, and it does full damage, 2 to 7 points, to any creature it strikes. For every 5 levels the magic user has attained, he may add an additional two missiles when employing the spell. So a 6th level magic user may cast 3 magic missiles at his target, and an 11th level magic user casts 5, and so on. Then it gives you the range, and then it says it's direct. Magic, range 6. That's a different spell. Okay, so that's Magic Missile there. Now, let's look at what it says here. This is the Holmes edition, 1977. Level 1, range 150 feet. A conjured missile equal to a magic arrow, and it does 1 die roll plus 1 point, so 2 to 7, to any creature it strikes. Roll the missile fire like a longbow arrow using the missile fire table. Higher level magic users fire more than 1 missile. It doesn't tell you how many because this only goes to level 3, so you don't need to know that for this particular version of the game. So this version of the game, as far as I know, is the only one other than 4th edition that requires you to make a hit roll to use a magic missile. Every other version of the game assumes that a magic missile is a direct automatic hit. You don't have to roll to hit. And it's part of why magic users always like that spell, because it's a guaranteed hit. There are some people who will say that the way that this was worded in Greyhawk was supposed to imply, because it says it's like a magic arrow, there's an implication that, well, magic arrow, you roll the hit, right? Because this is where it debuts. And here it says that you have to roll the hit, and it's not until you see Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition Player's Handbook where it specifies that you don't have to roll the hit for the magic missile, that it's an automatic hit. So not, whether you think that's the case in Greyhawk or not, it's a little vague, but in here it's very clear you have to roll to hit. So that's a huge change. Huge. It's just one spell, but it's a pretty big change just from the history of the game, where a magic missile is sort of like always that automatic. It's in 5th edition, magic missile for a magic user is almost like the Eldritch Blast for the warlock. It's, they always have something to do, so they can always do damage or whatever. So that's part of that. The other thing that's kind of interesting in here is for spell names for evil clerics. They get their own section. Evil cleric spells. Evil clerics have basically the same spells as do good clerics. However, spells in italics are reversed for evil clerics. The reverse spells are cause light wounds, detect good, darkness, contaminate food or water, cause fear, and curse. In original Dungeons and Dragons, a cleric spell that was reversed, it's my book's right here. A cleric spell that was reversed, it was just called a reversed cleric spell. So there's no special spell name for it. So if it's underlined, it's that you can reverse that spell. That's all that means. So cure light wounds, purify food and water, detect evil, cure disease. You see, it's the same spells, but you just reverse them if you're evil. But in here, they get special names. It's a small change, but it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of neat to have different spell names rather than just saying I'm doing the reverse version of bless. Okay, because that's kind of clunky. All right, now, kind of the last 2 things that I want to talk about. One is the sample dungeon. So I already kind of showed this to you, but there is a sample dungeon in here, which is really fun. So you have sample floor plans before that, and magic items. You have dungeon mastering, and then you have your sample dungeon, and that's the Tower of Xenopus. And I only pointed out because it's more detailed, but it's different from the sample dungeon that's in here. So there is a sample dungeon in book 3, volume 3, I should say, of original Dungeons and Dragons, and it's right here. It's just, as I said, it's not quite as detailed with as much stuff going on. So it's just different. It's neither here nor there. It's not one's better than the other. It's different. Okay, so that's the sample dungeon. Then you have monsters. So one of the things that you do see in here, Holmes Basic, is this wandering monster table. Okay, on page 10. I shouldn't have put that book back because I'm going to use it right now. Also in volume 3 of original Dungeons and Dragons, you have the monsters level tables. And you can see they're different. So if you match this up, there's more in the Holmes book than there are here. And of course, this one goes to level 6. This one only goes to level 3 because, again, Holmes ends at level 3. So the monster list is different. It's more detailed in Holmes. And of course, it only goes to 3rd level. So that's one thing that's different for the monsters. The other one that's going to be different for the monsters in Holmes, it's going to be something that's different from this. So this is Men and Magic, Volume 1 from Original Dungeons and Dragons, and it talks about experience points, and it says experience points are awarded to players by the referee with appropriate bonuses or penalties. All characters meet monsters in mortal combat and defeat them, and when they obtain various forms of treasure, money, gems, jewelry, magic items, etc., they gain experience. So again, the experience comes from the treasure that you get for defeating the monster, not from defeating the monster. You don't get XP for defeating the monster. In Greyhawk, that's changed a little bit. The wording has changed. And it says, the awarding of experience points is often a matter of discussion, for the referee must make subjective judgments rather than and then he puts in parentheses, ridiculous 100 points per level for slain monsters. Use the table below, dividing experience equally among. So this is going to start giving you experience points for defeating monsters, not just for the treasure that they have, but for the kind of monster it is. And that is going to get picked up in here. So this picks up the Greyhawk version of experience for slaying monsters. And, nowadays, that's how people play the game is you don't, in like 5e or 3e even, you don't get experience for getting treasure. You get experience for defeating monsters, but that wasn't always the case. In the old days, you got experience for the treasure itself. So 1 gold piece equaled 1 experience point. So that's why you went into the dungeons, and a lot of times why you wouldn't engage in combat, because that was dangerous and it might risk you losing your life or losing a level or whatever it was. So you might hide or bribe or do anything that you could to avoid fighting the monsters, just so you could get to its treasure hoard and take the treasure. And that alone got you the XP. So very different style of playing versus, march into the dungeon and, kill all the monsters. Okay, so that is it for the magic and also for monsters, the sample dungeon. And then lastly, what I wanted to talk about, this is the section I was mentioning about that original manuscript. So I've mentioned a few of these already, but I wanted to put it all in one place to let you know, like, what ended up being different in the published version of the Holmes Basics rulebook versus the the original manuscript and then the published version. So there's a few things here. So again, the 5-point alignment system, Holmes had a 3-point, but Gary Gygax or someone, I don't know that it was Gary, someone at TSR included the 5-point alignment system. So that was not part of the original manuscript. The simplified encumbrance that I talked about, that seems like it was added by Gary. So not having to keep track of the weight of all your items, but just kind of like listing them out to make sure, like eyeballing that you're not carrying too much. That was added by Gary. The evil cleric spell list of names of spells, that was added by Gary. The flaming oil section that I talked about in terms of like the, how it spreads across, makes pool and you light it on fire, that was added by Gary to the original manuscript. And then a big one is just this change in that light weapons like daggers attack 2 times per round. So originally, my understanding is in the original manuscript by Holmes, he said that any one-handed weapon attacked twice per round. So that was a huge change because it made it to be what they say daggers or light weapons. They don't define what a light weapon means. So again, that leaves it up to the DM to interpret that based on, I guess player input and requests. But that was a change that was made into the manuscript. So again, I think that's kind of an interesting thing to look at is like how much was, ended up being lifted or changed from the original manuscript that Eric J. Holmes wrote. But that being said, that is going to wrap up our look at these differences in D&D editions with our first installment of the difference between the Holmes edition of D&D, the basic set from 1977, and original D&D. So in the future, I'm going to cover, probably next, I will do Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition and how it's different from original. I'll also explain a little bit how it's different from Holmes, but they came out sort of the same year, so it's sort of hard to compare. This starts in 1977, as does this. So my AD&D comparison is probably mostly going to be based on how it's different from original D&D, and there's a lot of differences, folks, and it's minutia, but it's very different. I mean, it's the hit dice for different classes. It's level limits for different demi-humans. It's more stuff being added. It's more spells. It's adding segments as a breakout of the combat system. So it's not just turns and rounds, but you added another level of granularity with segments. It's weapon speed factors and, all this kind of stuff that was added to AD&D. So that's probably going to have to be a multi-part video because there's just no way I'm going to fit all that into one of my, long form videos. And you all know that my videos are very long. But I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I would love to hear from you if you liked it and what you thought of all these different changes, if you knew all of them, if you knew some of them, or, some of it was new to you, or maybe I forgot one of your favorite changes, mention that below. Let me know something else that was different in here versus this. And I would love to hear that. So I never played Holmes Edition, as I've mentioned before. So it's very possible that there was just something that skipped past me. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And so leave that in the comments below. And then, of course, while you're down in the comments below, you'll see in the show notes places where you can join me on social media on Facebook or Blue Sky or Instagram. I even have a Pinterest page. It's personal Pinterest, but you can join me on there if you want to see images that I use for like my daughter's game, things like that. So all that's in the show notes below, and you'll find links to my blog where I share content from time to time, usually for old school games, although it's usually system or edition neutral. So that's in there below. Now, coming up next time, today's November 18th. So next week, the week of November 25th, I am hoping to post a video, but I'll tell you right now, I usually record on Mondays and I'm not available on Monday nor Tuesday. And then Thursday's Thanksgiving, which means I'm going to be cooking on Wednesday. So I will try to get a video recorded at some point. But I'm going to be doing a 100th video special episode for folks. And I'm going to be doing that giveaway. So I mentioned this before. I mentioned it in last week's video, but I'm going to be doing a giveaway to give away an old copy of Gamma World from 1978. Again, it's beat up, and I've seen my last video about the character class from White Dwarf to learn more about the specifics of what's going on with these two box sets. And then Boot Hill, 1979. I believe this is the second edition of 1979. So I'm going to be doing a giveaway for those, and that all the details in that will be in my next video, my 100th video, with a special topic that a few people have requested. So it's been on my list for a while, and I thought I'd save it for the 100th episode. So with all that being said, I hope again that you enjoyed this video, and please do let me know in the comments. And with that being said, I would like to wish you all thank you for watching. First off, happy gaming, stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time. All right, and now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So there are a ton of notes. I actually started making my notes over the weekend. It was my wife and I took a short little trip up to wine country, Northern California or Central California, around San Luis Obispo area. And in the hotel room late one night, I sat up and I was like making my notes on some of the things that I wanted to cover in this particular video. And I had brought I have a little traveling bar case that, that I bring. It's actually my parents from the 60s. And I had filled it ahead of time and brought like a swing bottle of a batched cocktail that I had made. And anyway, it was this one. So I made this up. and it is a mixture of wild turkey, rosemary, simple syrup, lemon juice, and homemade cranberry bitters. So a little difficult for you to make, and that would be the cranberry bitters part. Now you can home make your cranberry bitters, as I just mentioned. It's a little laborious process to try to get enough cranberries. You have to buy them fresh, and you're drying them, and you're pressing the juice out, and you have to just strain it so many times. Or you could buy cranberry bitters online, which is what I would suggest. It would just be much easier. I did it as a challenge just to see if I could do it, but I was trying to make something Thanksgiving like, and so I have a little fresh sprig of rosemary here, and what I did with that is before I put it in the glass, so you just take it and you kind of slap it on the back of your hand to kind of release the oils and the aromatics, and then I dropped it into the glass. So you can definitely make your own rosemary syrup, which is quite easy, but this is the one I use because it was a gift from a friend. I just wanted to use it for something. So this is a brut rosemary syrup. But again, you could easily make your own, because all you have to do is just make regular simple syrup, 1-to-1 sugar to water, and you dissolve the sugar into the water, and then you add fresh rosemary and just let it steep. I would take the leaves off of the stem if you're going to do that. Let it steep like a tea almost until it cools down, and then just strain out the leaves, and voila, you've got a rosemary simple syrup. And what's cool about that is you can do it with any kind of herb. You can do sage, you can do thyme, you could do a mixture of all three. So if you don't like rosemary, make this drink with sage, but try to keep it something that you're going to maybe serve at if you're an American Thanksgiving. I know Canada already had theirs last month, but maybe you have a sage stuffed dressing or something like that, or a thyme dressing or thyme green beans. I don't know what you have. You could kind of match the drink to that flavor, which is something that I really like to do. So I did make this in honor of fall. So I'm using my little fall kind of leaf glass again. And I actually have another social media presence. I'm part of a 3-partner project called Cocktail Cadre, CADRE. And I'm going to be posting the recipe for this drink on our blog and on social media. So if you're interested in the cocktail portion and you ever want to learn more about that, definitely follow us there. And I'll put links to that in the show notes below. Okay, so cheers. Looking forward to the holiday season. And again, for Americans coming up, Thanksgiving is about a week and a half away. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that. So it's really just a sour. That's all it is. Spirit, sugar, citrus, bitters. It's a sour style drink. It's just you're kind of elevating it with the cranberry bitters, the rosemary, simple. And then I used wild turkey for the base because it's turkey. It's Thanksgiving, so obviously you could use any whiskey you want. I just used that for the play on words. All right. The album I was listening to is this one. This is Oliver Nelson's The Blues and the Abstract Truth. Originally came out in 1961 on Impulse. And the reason I was listening to this very specifically is because of this gentleman here, Roy Haynes, who does the drumming on this, passed away, unfortunately, last week on the 18th. And I have quite a few records that he played on. He's a very prolific jazz drummer, plays on one of my favorite Sarah Vaughan albums, Swingin' Easy. But I thought I would feature this one instead. The lineup on here is just incredible. Paul Chambers on bass, Eric Dolphy, Bill Evans on keys, Roy Haynes, and then Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. And then, of course, Oliver Nelson is playing saxophone. There is one other guy playing on this, and I just forgot his name, but he plays baritone sax. But such a great, great album. The one track that you may have heard before, if you know anything about jazz, because it's become standard and it does get covered a lot, is this leadoff track, Stolen Moments. So that particular one, you've got Eric Dolphy on flute, and then it's a great song. It's a great track. So, but Roy Haynes, again, he was 99, I believe. If he March 20 something, I think it's March of 2025 would have been his 100th birthday. He was born March 1925. And so he just missed his 100th birthday. And he was active all the way up until about a decade and a half ago, like touring and performing all the time. So just a huge loss to the jazz community with Roy Haynes. And I wanted to do a little tribute and an honor to him by featuring a record by him. I feel like I've been doing that a lot lately, Quincy Jones and some other folks, but it's important to remember these people. And so once again, I highly highly encourage you to check out this album, at least the lead off track. Just listen to it. It's just, it's such a great track, and hopefully that'll draw you in, and then you'll just want to listen to the whole album. All right, so that's going to be it for now. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Cheers, and I will talk to you next time.